thank you for joining us today. We've got teachers and students from all over Australia with over 9,000 people registered for this webinar. My name's Janine Kelly and I work at the education team at the Australian Children's Television Foundation. We're very pleased to be co-presenting this webinar today with the team at ACMI Education. My Place has been loved in Australian classrooms since its publication over 30 years ago. It tells the story of an Australian community through the eyes of the many children who lived there, showing how First Nations people and immigrants have helped to shape our national story. We're thrilled to have author Nadia Wheatley here to talk about her book, My Place, and to share some tips with the young writers that we have in our audience. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you very much, Janine. Yes, it's lovely to be here with all of you, sharing this webinar today, sharing our enjoyment, not just of the book My Place and of the TV series, but our enjoyment of our own places. And with that, we're just going to go to a short PowerPoint presentation in which we'll begin by acknowledging country, and then I'll show you where I got the idea for My Place. So the first slide in front of you is a group of children sitting on the ground with some Australian country above them and below them. And wherever you are in Australia, I want you to think of the traditional custodians of the land where you're meeting today. Bring their names into your mind, and if you don't know their names, I'll tell you later how to find out their names. And think about how children and families have been sharing stories and sharing place across this great continent for thousands and thousands of years. I am on Gadigal land, in the land of the Eora Nation. That means I'm in Sydney's inner west, but you'll probably be somewhere else. Wherever you are, you're walking or sitting or standing on Aboriginal land, and that's a great privilege that we have. And so it's terrific to say thank you for having us. And that's what we're going to do now. I invite you to speak with me the words that are on the slide. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and learn. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and we thank them for taking care of country over countless generations. Okay, we'll move on to our next slide. And here we have a picture of the book cover of the book My Place, and we have a poster for the television series My Place. So I hope you've seen, just for a few minutes at least, either or both the book or the TV series. We'll come back and look at that cover in a little bit of detail later, and we'll also be talking about that tree where the children are sitting in the My Place poster. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for over 30 years, I've talked to children around Australia about the book My Place. And when I do a question and answer, the first question I always get is, where did you get the idea for My Place? So I'm going to tell you the answer to that now, but it's also the answer to a question you might ask about your own writing, whether your own writing for the My Place competition that's happening, or just any writing that you might do in primary school or secondary school or for the rest of your life. So this is how I always get my ideas for stories. They are from the place where I am and from the things that happen to me. So you'll see a picture of a very energetic black dog at the top of your screen. That was my beloved dog that I had a long time ago, and every day I used to take him for a long run. Now, when he was young, he was a bit silly and he used to run out onto the road. So I'd have to find a place where he could run that would be safe. And on weekday afternoons, Monday to Friday, I used to go to an old graveyard that was near my house. And because the graveyard had a big fence around it, and I could let my dog off and he could run and run and he wouldn't get out onto the street. In that graveyard, there was a big old fig tree, an Australian fig tree of the kind that you can see, exactly the tree that's in the picture beneath my dog. And while he was running for half an hour or even an hour, I would sit on the roots of that fig tree, very comfy like an armchair, and I would think of the generations of children going back through all the time when multicultural people had come to this land and back into Aboriginal time. I would think of those children playing in that tree, maybe climbing it, maybe building forts, building tree houses, or just going to the tree like I was to have a bit of a sit and to think. On Sundays, when I had more time, I wouldn't go in the afternoon with my dog. I'd go in the morning across the suburb to the street that you can see in the top photo, a street of very crowded together houses and warehouses, old factories, not a posh street. And I would think about the people who in those houses had lived for a long time, and I'd go down the street, you can see it sloping, and at the bottom of the street there was a dirty old canal. You can see that in the bottom photo. A canal is a former creek that's been closed in, and along this canal there were warehouses and factories. And though the water was rather dirty, I worked out that once upon a time it would have been beautiful fresh water. Once I knew that Aboriginal people would have camped beside that water, because water's very heavy to carry and it's difficult to carry. So Aboriginal people would always stay near the fresh water, though they would live right across the land and use the land and have all the land would be their country. They would make their mura, their little homes, next to the fresh water. So I could take away those factories in my imagination and people that creek with Aboriginal people. So that was how I got the idea of a story that would go from now into the far past, but a story that would have Aboriginal people at the beginning and end, and the multicultural Australia at the centre. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here we see that tree in a bit more detail, and I've told you where I live. I live on Cadigal land, and that tree, that graveyard is very close. I often go there in the afternoon now, though sadly I no longer have my puppy dog. And so you can see a real photo taken by me of the tree, and that tree is used in the TV series My Place. So they used the exact location, and you can see the actors for the first series, for the first 13 episodes, all sitting in that tree. When I saw that photo, in fact, I was there the day it was taken, it was like my imagination coming to life. And that's what happens when we write. The things in our imagination come to life. I was just a little bit extra lucky because one of my stories actually got acted out by real life actors. But you don't have to have that happen. It's just as real when your stories are told by you. Okay, next picture. Okay, so when I'm doing my research, what I do is I make little maps. I take the pressure off myself. I don't worry about my first sentence or what the story is about. I just get out my coloured pencils and I do a little map. And here we see a map of, I think it looks a bit like that sea creature called a stingray. We see a map of the bay. We see the tidal river, the salty water river, running in from the sea. And can you see a little blue line I've drawn, which is the freshwater creek that became the canal? We've got a brown line for the track and a green splodge for the fig tree, and some little half moons, which are Aboriginal mura, Aboriginal shelters or homes that I've drawn along the fresh water. So that was enough of a map for me to get started on my story. Okay, we'll have the next slide. This drawing was done by me one Sunday night when I didn't have anything to watch on TV and I didn't have a good book to read. So I got out this time just my lead pencil and a biro and an exercise book. I drew an Aboriginal flag at the top of the page, and I started to draw a map, not of the place in its landscape, but of the real life place with houses in it. And as I was doing the map, the character and the words of the story popped into my brain. So without me trying to think of a story, I found myself writing the words, my name's Laura, this is my place. My house is the one with the flag on the window. And from those first words, I got the idea of the story. I got the story mapped out quite quickly by the Thursday of that week, and I sent it to my good friend Donna Rawlins and asked her if she'd like to do the pictures. So I didn't do the pictures in the book. Donna did the pictures, and of course you don't write a story in 4 days. I had to go and do a lot more research. But that first inspiration, and that's what we're talking about today, the first inspiration came from the place and the map. Next one. Okay, so now we've got 2 pictures from the television series, and we've got the actors at the beginning and end of the TV series, the Aboriginal actors portraying the Aboriginal characters. And I put this slide in because I want you to think of the story of My Place, whether you see it on TV or whether you read it as a book or both, to see it being embraced. Imagine your arms going around in a big hug and hugging something. The whole story is hugged between, it's embraced by these First Nations narrator, Barangaroo and Laura, and their elders, who are very important in the story. Next one. Okay, so now we have the first spread, the first double page from the picture book of My Place, and it starts with those words I thought that exciting Sunday night. My name's Laura, and this is my place. Our house is the one with the flag on the window. And you see Laura sitting with her puppy dog. You see her crowded street and her house with the flag on the window. She draws you a map, and you see her having a birthday party up at the big tree. So on every double page of My Place, you get a pet and a party and a map and the big tree. And in every episode of the TV series, those same elements are there. Okay, the next one. And so here we have the second last, not the last page of the book. We've got the second last page of the book, and the narrator says, the narrator's just the storyteller. The storyteller says, my name's Barangaroo. I belong to this place. We're staying here for the summer at the creek camp to get the fish down in the bay, but everywhere we go is home. And you can see she too has a pet, a dog a bit like Laura's dog. The family and the clan are having a big party down on the bay, and she does a map of her place. So in that map, we can see the bay and the river and the creek that I doodled in my map, my own map of the place. Next picture. So we're going back now to the cover of the book, which Donna Rawlins drew, and we'll just have a little look at what the cover might tell us. When Donna was doing the pictures, she and I were living in different bits of Australia. And one night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, actually, I'd gone to sleep and the phone rang. In those days, we didn't have little cell phones. It was a landline. I had to jump out of bed and go and answer the phone. And when the phone rings in the night, you sometimes think something's terrible has happened. So when Donna was literally screaming down the phone, I thought something terrible had happened. And she screamed, "I ripped the cover." And I knew she was working very hard on the artwork, and I thought she'd made a mistake. But she was ringing me not in fright, but in excitement. And you can see in the cover of My Place, do you see that white sort of tear line that goes between the city street and the picture of the bush? And she thought this clever idea of ripping the expensive thick art paper that she was drawing on so she could show the Aboriginal land underneath the built environment of the city. And that is a wonderful metaphor. It was very clever of Donna to do that, because in My Place, we're peeling back or ripping back the layers to take the city away and the modern people away, and going back to the history to bring out that idea that wherever we are, we're walking on Aboriginal land. But also the idea that whoever we are, wherever our families come from, we're all making history, and we're making history in the present every day by the choices we make and by the things that we do. Okay, next one. So here's a quick little map from My Place drawn by Donna from the maps I did. And I just want to put this up because we're going to talk about looking for diversity, looking for community in your place. And remember that in the maps of my place, along the shopping street, we have all the shops, we have the neighbours, we have the different people of the community. We have public buildings, factories, parks, and most importantly, we have waterways. Next one. And here we have the actors from my place walking on Aboriginal land, just to remind us that that's a theme of the book in past and in present. Next one. Okay, the very, very last page of the book. And here Barangaroo sits up the tree and she says, when she looks one way, the sea goes out till it meets the sky. But if she looks the other way, the land goes on till the sun sets. And look at the colours on that page. Think of what flag you remember when you look at the colours on that page. And Barangaroo's grandmother says, we've always belonged to this place. But how long, I ask, I, Barangaroo, ask, and how far? My grandmother says, forever and ever. So we're thinking of the very, very long, round, circular time of Aboriginal history, going back thousands and thousands of years. And we're thinking of the country, the land, and the flag. Okay, we're finishing our slideshow and we'll go back to questions. Janine?
Yeah, I love listening to you talk. I could listen all day. I especially like hearing about how you've worked with Donna on the illustrations. I find it really interesting. You've talked a lot about where you found your inspiration for My Place. I'm just wondering, could you tell us a bit about how students might find inspiration for their own writing?
Yes, what we want you to do is to write about your place and your family and your community. Now, this doesn't mean you can't make things up. I made up the story of My Place, but I made it up from real life bits and pieces of history. The best way to get that is to walk around. I know you might be in lockdown. I'm in lockdown, but I am allowed to go for a little walk around the streets of my place, even with one other person. And so as I walk, I use my senses. I use my eyes, my ears, I even use my nose. And I use my feet to tell me about history because my feet are very important. They tell me if I'm going uphill or downhill. And if I'm going downhill, I know that I'm going the way that the water runs when it rains. Even in the city where a lot of the old creeks and waterways have been hidden, we can tell from the movement of the water in the gutters where the fresh water is. Once we know where the fresh water is, we know where the Aboriginal people would have camped every night. And we also know where the first non-Indigenous people, whether they came from England or Ireland or China or wherever they came from, we know where they too would have made their homes and built their little farms and, unfortunately, in some cases, their factories, which polluted those waterways. So walk around your area, keep your eyes open, take photos, draw little maps and get a sense of your own place, and that will be the starting point. You can write a story set in outer space. You can write a story set in another country. But if you know your own place well, you'll have the building blocks for all your writing. Next one, Janine.
Thanks, Nadia. So this is, I love how you talk about finding clues in people's own community to write. You mentioned earlier, kids can also look to their own families and their own history in that area to find inspiration for their writing.
Yes, well, the first thing I'd suggest, remember in those slides we've just seen, we saw the Aboriginal actors and we saw the Aboriginal characters, Laura and Barangaroo. And remember I said that it's like those, I'm putting my arms around in a big hug to hug all of you, but also to mimic the way those Aboriginal storytellers in My Place embrace the story. So whatever we're going to write about, the first thing I think you need to do is to find out about the Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people of your area, the First Nations people. And the first thing to do is to find out their name, the name of the clan, the name of the language group, the name of the nation. Wherever you live in Australia or the Torres Strait, there are those names available. You can go onto your local government website and find them out. And I'm sure most of your schools will already be acknowledging country, so you'll already know. Find out how those First Nations people lived in your area, not across the whole of Australia, in your area. And the key to that is finding the fresh water. Then history's about now. Find out if there are First Nations people living in your area today, going to your school. And of course, some of you will be First Nations people. So you can tell your classmates about your own culture and your own society. Look for names of streets and places that'll give you a key. In my area, there's a place called the Walleye Creek. So I know that that's an Aboriginal name. You might be living in a place called Warrnambool or Wagga Wagga. It might be a place, or Kiama, a place with an Aboriginal name. So look for that evidence of Aboriginal language around you. Then moving on to the next bit of the research, ask about the non-Indigenous, let's call them Second Nations people who arrived in this land. I don't want you to research the whole of Australia, but just think about your place, your area. I can't tell you the answers, but I can tell you the questions to ask, and you need to know, why did they come, when did they come, and where did they come from? But most significantly, look at your own families. Why did your own families come to the place where you're living, and when did they come? So go and ask grandma, ask mum, ask dad, ask your aunties and uncles. Find out the history of your own family. Okay, next one.
Thank you, Nadia. You've spoken so beautifully about the diversity in my place, and you were very passionate about representing First Nations and multicultural voices in the book as well. How can kids learn to recognise diversity in their own community? What kind of clues should they look out for?
Okay, well, think about your neighbours. I've got a very, very elderly, even older than me, Greek Australian man lives 2 doors down from me, and I see him out in the street. So think about your neighbours. Walk along your shopping centre. Look at the shops. See if there's shops selling different products that you don't know the name of. Think about organisations, sporting clubs, places of worship, churches, mosques, soccer clubs that have particular ethnic connections. Think about those things in your own area. And of course, in your school, you'll have children probably who have English as a second language and who have some other cultural background. So food and celebration is not the full part of any culture, but it's a good way to start. So find out what kind of parties and celebrations are happening, just as on every page of My Place, we have a party, and in every episode of the TV series, there's a celebration or a party.
Thanks, Nadia. One thing I guess that teachers might be interested in hearing about, and I wondered myself, was what should we be mindful of when we're writing about people from other communities? If we're not writing about our own communities, how can we be sensitive in our representations?
It is easy to make mistakes. It's easy to hurt people in the way we describe them. So the best thing is to just be mindful. We use that word respect, but then I think it's just as good to think about how you would like other people to write about you or your family or your culture, and apply that as your rule when you're writing about other people. I know you wouldn't want to cause people harm. I know you wouldn't want to seem racist, but sometimes it's possible to do that by mistake. If you're worried or in doubt, go and ask your teacher for a bit of help and say, is this okay to say this? Or is this okay to ask this? Okay, we'll move on to the next question.
Thanks, Nadia. So My Place was a narrative. It's a picture storybook, but I know that when I've heard you speak before, you're really passionate about kids writing true stories as well. There's a lot of value in non-fiction. Could you tell us some of the ways that authors might be able to share their stories, and how young writers can think about the best form for the story that they want to tell?
Yes, so you might just leap in with all your wonderful enthusiasm and write a made-up imaginative story, and that's fine. But you might also like to think before you start writing that there are different ways you could do that. So whether you're going to write this as history or as a fiction made-up story, you might not just want to write it as a straight recount. For example, you might do it as letters. So you might imagine that you're writing from now to a friend in the past, or you might imagine two children in the past writing to each other. You might write it as a diary. You might write it as a little play, just as dialogue between two people. We don't want you to write a great big thing. Just 1 page or 2 pages would be a great thing to write about. Another way to start is to get what's called a memento. A memento is something that is like a family treasure that helps you remember something. I've brought along one of my family treasures, which is this Syrian doll. My mother was a nurse in World War II, and so she was based in what was then called the Middle East, in Palestine, in Egypt, in those countries, and she bought this wonderful handmade doll. And so I could start with that doll as a thing to inspire my story. You could start with a photograph. I'm sure you've all got photos of maybe mum when she was a little girl, or grandpa when he was a boy. Start with one of those photos. Start with an incident that happened to someone else in your family when they were little, and just write about that story. Another way to do it is to imagine a newspaper and write a newspaper account of something that happened. Or you could write the whole thing as a poem. So there's many different ways that you could write your story. My way of starting, as I keep saying, is as a map. So for whatever of those ways I started with, my first thing to do would be to get out my coloured pencils, take all the worry of writing out of my brain, and just let my hand take over almost, and do a map of the place, and then let the characters come into it, imaginary characters or real characters, and then let the story, fictional or real, take over.
Thank you, Nadia. Now, we are running out of time here, but we've got so many questions coming through from children in the chat. They're eager to know. So I might just fire you a couple of quick questions, if that's okay. Quite a lot of young writers are asking how long it took you to finish off My Place. You said that you came up with that idea quickly, but how long did the whole editing process take?
The whole thing, because Donna and I both had to do a lot of history research in libraries and books and records, the whole thing took us 18 months. So that's 1.5 years. But that was working absolutely every day of those 18 months. And it was often working into the late hours of the night. So a book of this kind would usually take about 3 years to do. So this is why we're just asking you to do a very little job. We don't want you to write a great big thing that you haven't got time to do.
Thank you, Nadia. Someone else also asks, did you enjoy English and writing when you were young, or was this something that came later?
Okay, so from when I was 4 or 5, I said to my mother, I'm going to be a writer when I'm a grown-up, because I loved her reading me stories, but she also was a wonderful storyteller, and she would tell me stories. She'd tell me stories about her own childhood and also her time in the war, what she'd done, but she would also make up stories. So from a love of story and also a love of books, I always knew that the only job I ever wanted to do was to be a writer, and it is the only job I've ever done. I've never been a school teacher or a garbage collector or a bus driver, or an astronaut. I've only ever been a writer.
That's so interesting that you knew before, when you were a kinder back in prep, what your destiny was. So thank you so much for sharing, Nadia. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along today, because the time has just zoomed by and we're right at the end of our session today. We've had people from all over Australia join us. So I'd like to thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to Nadia for sharing so much about your love with us. And thank you to the ACMI Education team and ACTF staff behind the scenes.
And
for anyone
too.
Thank you, Nadia. For anyone that's joining us in the 2021 My Place competition, you can find all the details online on the ACTF site. We would love to have your entries, and teachers will be in touch with a follow-up email that will point you to where you can see the recording of this session. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you once again.